Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this today. We're going to dive into a seriously wild, chaotic, and remarkably transformative 4-year stretch from 1971 to 1975 that fundamentally reshaped global finance and geopolitical power. If you really want to understand how the modern economic world works, you have to understand the 1970s. So let's just dive right in.
When we think about the economic upheavals of the early 1970s, we usually picture presidents, prime ministers, maybe some very public oil tycoons. But what if the real architects of global policy were operating entirely behind the scenes? What if the strings were actually being pulled by private consultants who were using debt as a weapon?
To figure that out, we're going to look through the first-hand lens of John Perkins. Early in his career, he was just this guy fresh out of the Peace Corps. But during the 1970s, he transitioned from a young recruit to the chief economist at an ultra-private consulting firm called Maine. Now, according to his highly charged memoir, his actual job was to act as an economic hitman, basically someone who purposefully over-forecasted economic growth just to justify massive international loans, deliberately trapping developing nations in insurmountable debt.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll follow Perkins' journey year by year. We're starting in 1971 in Indonesia, moving to Panama in 1972, zooming out for the 1973 oil embargo, and wrapping up with a highly secretive deal in Saudi Arabia in 1974.
Part 1. The Indonesian Puppet Show. Bandung, Indonesia, 1971.
So Perkins gets sent out to the island of Java to forecast its energy needs. The U.S. was desperate to keep Indonesia, and especially its massive oil and mineral wealth, away from communist influence. While he's in the city of Bandung, Perkins goes to the street performance by a local dalong, which is a puppet master. Now, a dalong is essentially a shaman who performs in a trance, manipulating shadows and speaking in all these multiple voices. But this wasn't just some traditional mythic play, right? It was a real-time, highly political critique of global economics. Picture this. The puppet master actually brings out a puppet of U.S. President Richard Nixon, and he's standing right next to a bucket man holding a bucket covered in dollar signs, which represented the World Bank. The Nixon puppet literally lifts up a map of Indonesia and declares, "Give this one to the World Bank. See what it can do to make us some money off Indonesia." This brilliantly captures how the local population actually viewed that incoming flood of foreign infrastructure loans. They saw right through the whole veneer of foreign aid. Then, at the climax of the street play, a puppet representing a popular local politician steps forward to block Nixon, yelling, "Indonesia is sovereign," but the bucket man swiftly impales the local politician with an American flag. For Perkins, this metaphorical puppet show was a massive wake-up call. It crystallized the reality of his job. The corporatocracy wasn't using troops to conquer. They were using international debt.
Part 2. The Panamanian Resistance. Panama, 1972. Fast forward just 1 year. Perkins is promoted to chief economist, and he's deployed to Panama. It's a tiny nation, sure, but an incredibly crucial one. There, he comes face to face with the country's leader, General Omar Torrijos. And the contrast between their two visions was just staggering. According to Perkins, the U.S. corporatocracy wanted absolute control over the Panama Canal and wanted to install these compliant puppet governments. But Torrijos, he had a completely different agenda. He wanted true Panamanian sovereignty, and he wanted the profits of the canal to actually benefit the impoverished people of his country, not just line the pockets of foreign corporations and a few local elites. Torrijos was incredibly clear about this. He told Perkins directly, "We must prove to the world that Panama is a reasonable country, that we stand not against the United States, but for the rights of the poor." Torrijos was walking a very dangerous tightrope here. He wanted the canal back, but he adamantly refused to align with Soviet communism to get it. He managed to ground these abstract concepts of colonialism into a very specific, deeply human fight for his people's dignity. Part 3. The 1973 Oil Shock, a geopolitical earthquake. Now, let's pivot to the macro level. October 1973. A massive geopolitical earthquake absolutely shatters global economics when Egypt and Syria launch an attack on Israel. In retaliation for the U.S. supporting Israel, the Arab oil-producing states deploy what became known as the oil weapon. They imposed a total embargo on oil shipments to the United States. And this wasn't just some political statement. It was a systemic shock that literally brought the industrialized world grinding to a terrifying halt. The math on this is just staggering. The price of Saudi oil skyrocketed from $1.39 a barrel in 1970 to over $8 by the start of 1974. That kind of price shock brought industrial giants straight to their knees. We're talking lines at gas stations stretching for miles. For the global elites and the U.S. government, this created a desperate existential need for a brand new financial playbook. They realized right then and there they could never, ever let an embargo like this happen to them again.
Part 4. The Masterpiece. Sama. Saudi Arabia, 1974. This brings us to the climax of the era. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia hash out this highly clandestine deal known as the Saudi Arabian Money Laundering Affair, or SAMA for short. To really grasp the scale of this, you have to picture Saudi Arabia at that specific time. A Saudi diplomat actually showed Perkins a photo of goats eating garbage right outside a government building in Riyadh. Why? Because, as the diplomat explained, they literally didn't have a trash collection system. Then, almost in the blink of an eye because of this deal, those goats were replaced by a $200 million contract with an American company for a massive fleet of state-of-the-art trash compactor trucks. Overnight, Saudi Arabia was blasted into the modern era.
So how did this massive transformation actually work? Well, it was a brilliantly simple recycling loop. Step 1. The Saudis sell their oil to the world, suddenly flushed with an ocean of new cash from the price hikes. Step 2. The U.S. requires Saudi Arabia to take those petrodollars and purchase U.S. government securities. Step 3. The U.S. Treasury uses the interest from those exact securities to hire American engineering and construction firms to build up Saudi infrastructure. We're talking power grids, highways, entire cities from scratch. The money just cycled right back into the American corporate economy, all while physically westernizing Saudi Arabia.
Part 5. A New Global Strategy. Building Today's World.
You see, the events of the early 1970s didn't just stay in the past. They built the exact world we're living in right now. The legacy of the SAMA deal is profoundly complex. For one, it completely entrenched the U.S. dollar as the dominant global currency, cementing American economic dominance for decades to come. It also thoroughly westernized Saudi infrastructure. However, Perkins also points out a much darker consequence. He claims this immense influx of wealth and that deep U.S.-Saudi relationship later facilitated the funding of the Mujahideen in the Afghan war against the Soviets, a move which ultimately funneled billions of dollars to groups linked to Osama bin Laden.
Before we wrap this up, it's vital to remember that this explainer is distilling the specific, highly charged first-hand accounts from John Perkins' memoir, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. We've been looking at the 1970s through his eyes, exploring a historical shift where old-school military imperialism was largely traded in for a completely new kind of global empire building, one driven by economics, debt, and infrastructure.
And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to ponder today. Look at the structures of international debt right now. Look at the massive infrastructure deals happening across the globe and the ongoing struggles for sovereignty in developing nations. Are the strings of the global economy still being pulled by the exact same strategies engineered in the 1970s? It is a fascinating history, and understanding it really is the key to decoding our present. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking those big questions and keep learning.